Hello everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to talk about what is English tea. Now before we begin, I highly recommend you check out the previous installments of this playlist, in particular episode 1 and then the episode on black tea, which hint hint gives you an idea what English tea is. So English tea is not a tea that's made in England. So the tea plant, the Camellia sinensis, has two variants essentially, Camellia sinensis sinensis and Camellia sinensis assamica. The former, it mostly grows in mid-latitudes, cooler climates, so China and Japan in particular. And then the Assamica grows in India, Sri Lanka, Kenya, that area. And that's a bolder, bigger leaf and bolder. Again, go to episode 1. And that's going to be the connection to English tea. So English tea is not grown in England. England does not grow tea. But the connection, of course, is that English tea is going to be tea that comes from former British colonies originally. And we will do an episode on the history of tea. But English tea in its simplest definition is a combination of various black teas into an amalgam. More often than not, English tea is still consumed by English people and people around the world who like English tea in sachets or tea bags. There is, of course, a resurgence of loose leaf tea, kind of high-end tea, so you will see people who drink English tea in that variety. But if you were to go to Amazon, for example, and of course I don't recommend you buy any tea at Amazon, buy it at Green Tea House online, but if you were to go to Amazon and you were to Google English tea, it's almost always going to be in sachets. So English tea is black tea. So what do you know already there if you've been watching these in a row? Black tea has a lot of caffeine. Black tea is fully oxidized Camellia sinensis leaves, and it's going to have a bold, robust taste. Regardless if you're doing a lighter black like a Darjeeling, which is not typically in an English tea, or if you're going to do a more of a bold one like an Assam, which is typically an English tea, that's what you're going to find. You're going to find a bold taste. And because, as I mentioned in the black tea episode, the bolder black teas tend to complement well or tend to be supplemented well with milk and sugar. Like you would never put milk and sugar into like a lightly oxidized Taiwanese Alishan oolong, or you would never put milk and sugar into a gyokuro. I mean, this would be anathema, a Japanese tea. But with the English tea, of course, a lot of you guys know that English tea, customarily, is served with milk and sugar, and it's typically going to be in these types of cups right here. And the combination varies. So if you look at, and there's no like Bible guideline of what's the ratio in there, but typically you're going to find like an Assam, you might find the Kenyanese black teas, you might find a Keeman, which is more of a Chinese tea. The Irish have their own tea, the Irish tea, and it tends to be bolder, and so you'll find more Keeman. Keeman is a Chinese black tea, and so the more high-end English teas will have Keeman in it. But if you look at the typical one's going to have like Ceylon, or the tea that comes from Sri Lanka, and it's going to have, typically going to have maybe just a standard black tea. But it typically will not, and I know I'm saying typically a lot, it's not going to have a Darjeeling. It's just going to be a combination of black teas that come from former British colonies. And the quick history for this is early in colonization, the Portuguese were the first to kind of discover Chinese tea, and they brought it back to Portugal. Charles II, monarch of England in the 1660s, he had a Portuguese wife, so she kind of brought that tea to England, which kind of popularized it. And so the English wanted to get tea from China, but it was pretty expensive because the markets were closed, and again, think of transportation costs. So they figured out through some botanists, and again, we'll talk about this later on, and some of their holdings, namely Assam and India in this area, that the two variants of the Camellia sinensis plant either grew there naturally, or they were able to transport it, kind of steal some seeds from China. And then they figured out that the black tea could be grown in British colonies, namely various regions of eastern India. So if you look at the kind of area closer to Bhutan and Bangladesh, the Darjeeling area, really, essentially. It could be grown over there. It could be grown in Sri Lanka, present-day Sri Lanka, which, of course, back then was called Ceylon. And then it could be grown in Kenya. And you still see these places growing a lot of black tea. Kenya, for example, is pretty famous for doing a lot of CTC, which is curl, tear, crush, which is arguably the low-grade That's like the Fannings that they put in sachets. So it's the most low grade one. But either way, so eventually they didn't have to go to China to get the tea because they were growing it in their own holdings, the English. And so they were able to transport this back to England, which made tea a lot more affordable. And of course, the Boston Tea Party, that wasn't like, I don't know, Hojicha or Sencha or something. No, that was black tea. That was English tea. So in closing, and we'll have various episodes later on about different kind of cultivars and very different variants of black tea, either that we sell at Green Tea House or we don't. Like we currently don't sell just English tea because I think there's just better black teas out there, and I like to think that we sell those black teas. But English tea is exceedingly popular, and many of you know that a lot of people like to consume it with the kind of the afternoon tea, or they'll drink it in the morning. So the morning English tea tends to be stronger and heartier. And this kind of goes back to the Industrial Revolution, kind of working class English blokes, and they needed like a hearty, warm, robust tea with a lot of caffeine to get them through the day. Then you have like afternoon tea. Afternoon tea tends to be a lighter black tea. And when you think of British afternoon tea, that's more of the cucumber sandwiches and the crumpets and all those things like that. Either way, English tea, of course, is woven into the ethos of England, similar to how the Japanese teas or do the same thing in Japan and the various Chinese teas are in China. But certainly it is kind of woven into the English world. And even though coffee has increased in popularity in England and like it has here in the United States, tea actually is still consumed more in England than coffee. And typically it's going to be English tea, which is a combination of various black teas, or one of the offshoots like a first flush Darjeeling or an Earl Grey. You know, Earl Greys are pretty popular. That's essentially a black tea with bergamot in it. And so there's just different varieties. But in short, in closing, black tea, English tea is a black tea, hearty, robust combination of various black teas, and you typically mix it with milk and sugar. Guys, post in the comments if you like English tea or Irish tea. Until next time, take care, God bless and pray.